Well, it is a real pleasure to be introducing my next guest. She is Sarah Elmeligi, and she's the executive director of the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society. She is a PhD in more disciplines than I know even how to pronounce. Sarah, thank you so much for taking some time and chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Now, the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, talk a little bit, I guess, right off the get-go here. What is the Wildlife Society and sort of why are you guys in existence here in Alberta?
Sure. Well, the Wildlife Society is actually an international organization that has been in existence for quite a long time. It's really started with scientists and wildlife managers coming together to share knowledge and further wildlife science and management in North America. And so the Alberta chapter is a chapter of this larger society. And our mission is really to inspire and empower wildlife professionals to engage in science-based management and conservation of Alberta wildlife and their habitats. So for me, the two key components of what we do are, one, we're very science-based. We like to ensure decisions regarding wildlife management and habitat management in Alberta are based on current and robust science. And our second function is really bringing people together, because the challenges that our wildlife face in Alberta are very complex. And the more minds and perspectives we can have involved in that conversation, the better we can influence management in a positive way for wildlife.
Well, it's exactly that science-based approach that I wanted to reach out to you and get the perspective of your chapter in terms of what I mean, obviously the government has made some changes in terms of moving ahead with wholesale coal development along the Eastern Slopes. Nonetheless, there are still some plans and mines that are being proposed and under consideration. So from a scientific perspective, when you folks looked at the cumulative effect of what could be coming out of these mines, where do you stand?
Well, I mean, we were one of the participants in the public hearing for the Grassy Mountain mine process, which happened in November to early December. And that particular mine, the Grassy Mountain coal mine north of Blairmore, is the one that is furthest along in the regulatory approval process. And so for that particular project, we have stated opposition. We don't think the Grassy Mountain mine should be approved. But we've also shared concerns with the Alberta Energy Regulator around some of the exploration proposals that have also been approved, including Cabin Ridge and Elan, which are further north from where Grassy Mountain is on the Eastern Slopes. And a big part of our concern actually stems not necessarily from coal, but because these landscapes are already highly impacted. So there's already a pretty high level of human activity in this part of Alberta in regards to forestry and oil and gas exploration and development, a pretty prolific network of motorized and non-motorized recreation trails. There's obviously also some communities in that landscape and ranch lands and grazing leaseholders. And not to say that all of these things have, the same level or intensity of impact, but when we look at the Eastern Slopes, it is really important to consider that it's not a pristine landscape where nothing is going on. There's actually a lot of things going on, and each of those things has its own impact on wildlife and habitat. And a cumulative effects analysis really takes all of those pieces and combines them together. It's like forestry plus oil and gas plus ranching plus communities plus recreation equals the overall impact to the landscape. And what we did just over the last couple of years, we've been working with ALCES to conduct a cumulative effects assessment of the Oldman and Bow watersheds based on current and projected development to get a sense of how all of these human activities combine to impact the ecological integrity of the Eastern Slopes.
So Are we at a tipping point? As you already indicated, there are a lot of activities that are taking place within this land base. We add one more to the mix, i.e., coal or other industrial developments. Is that it? Do we kind of just say, well, this is what we choose to do, and that we're going to have to live with those consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to define something like a tipping point. Scientifically, sometimes it can be very difficult to quantify exactly where that point is until you're already past it. So typically, tipping points are a lot easier to define, a decade later when you can look back on all the data and you can say, oh, yeah, it was in, this year when this happened that we really created some kind of large scale impact. But what we are seeing in our cumulative effects assessment that we did is that this area is currently impacted by human activities. And our cumulative effects assessment really focused on trout because they are a strong indicator of sustainability for the larger watershed. And we have 3 species of native stream trout in the Eastern Slopes, and all of them are threatened or declining or endangered. So we really focused our assessment on trout to get a sense of what overall watershed health could be. And the result is that we can't maintain a healthy watershed and healthy trout populations if everyone can do almost anything at any time in the Eastern Slopes. And so really we need to be working towards setting ecologically relevant limits and thresholds to avoid the risks posed by additive land use effects on trout. And so what we really need to be thinking about is not how do we incorporate new large-scale development, but we really need to be thinking about preventing harmful future development, reclaiming temporary footprints that exist now. So that could include roads that are no longer required for industrial practices, or oil and gas well pads for oil facilities that are no longer in operation. And we also need to think about managing access in order to improve trout performance in these watersheds.
So, sorry. So I guess something you said there kind of tweaked another response for me, and you say we need to be aware of harmful developments. I guess that's where the rub is, because you've got industry, you've got coal that says what we're doing is manageable. We don't feel that we are creating an issue. So we're still back back at square one if we can't come to terms over what is harmful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right, Michael. That is a difficult term because I think the word harmful is subjective, and what one person might perceive as being harmful, another might not. But I think one of the reasons why this issue has really floated to the top in the minds of Albertans right now is that, coal mining, as you brought up, is this huge topic of conversation provincially, and obviously there are quite significant impacts with cutting out a huge piece of the landscape to remove coal. It's a very large, visually impactful and ecologically impactful practice. But I think what I also would like to challenge Albertans to consider is that all of our activities have impact on the landscape. So it's not about trying to say this is worse than this or this is worse than this. In this particular case, it's about trying to consider how all of these activities add together to create the total picture. And what our cumulative effects analysis shows is that the current level of activity on the Eastern Slopes is sufficient to cause significant impact to trout populations and grizzly bears and other species like limber pine and whitebark pine as well. And so where we're already at is having a significant impact on these wildlife populations and their habitats. And so if we want to pile on top a series of coal mines, then those impacts will increase dramatically again. And then we will really start to we could start to see some impacts and consequences of that maybe we're not prepared for as Albertans. I'd hate to see trout disappear from some of these streams on the eastern slopes, but the reality is that trout species have disappeared from some streams on the eastern slopes already. It would just not be very nice to see that continuing to happen. And I know a lot of Albertans really appreciate the angling opportunities and the recreation opportunities on the eastern slopes, and those activities are having an impact. And so if we keep piling that on, we're actually going to affect our potential for recreation enjoyment in this landscape too, I think.
It probably won't surprise you that recently I just came across an article that indicates that only 14% of the river basins in the world are, I guess, healthy enough that they are rated as undisturbed by humans. That leaves a big number in terms of what impact we're having on river basins, like the Old Man, as an example. Is that sort of the trend that can we step back from this brink? Can we turn that around? Should we be turning it around?
Well, I think we need to consider what level of impact is acceptable. We can have an impact on a stream, but if the stream is still ecologically functioning and still provides abundant fish habitat and a high level of water quality, maybe our impact is not as concerning. One of the things that's really concerning about these coal mines is the potential for selenium release into the water stream or into streams and into the watershed. And selenium, although it can be naturally occurring in very small amounts, coal mining does create additive selenium to watersheds, and that has huge impact on the health of fish and potentially the health of people as well. So, that is kind of an impact that I think we should be a lot more conscientious of, because that could potentially be polluting water for millions of people and definitely millions of fish. So I think it's about defining as a society, like, what is the level of impact that we're comfortable with? And as Albertans, I think, this kind of starts to stray a little bit from the science, but I do think that this is an issue that appeals to all Albertans, which is why it's turning into such a big provincial conversation. And I think each of us individually needs to think about what level of impact we're comfortable with on the eastern slopes.
Is it just a question of level of impact, though, versus what that economic factor is taking place? What industry is on that landscape that may have impact on it? So, in other words, could we find economic activities on a particular landscape that may not be as damaging as one that would be damaging?
Yeah, I mean, obviously economics always enter into the conversation when we're talking about conservation or management of wildlife and their habitats. And one of the things that we included in our cumulative impacts assessment was to try to identify a trade-off between protection of these watersheds and economic opportunity for resource extraction. And one of the results of our cumulative effects is that if we prioritize protection in the western portion of the study area, which would sort of be closer to the headwaters of these streams, we might be able to define an appropriate balance between trout conservation and resource development. But that balance and where we identify where the balance is and what areas we prioritize for protection, that doesn't have to be based on assumption or somebody's favorite trout stream. There is science that can actually feed into that decision, and we can prioritize particular streams or headwaters for trout protection in a way that we would still allow for ample economic opportunity on the eastern slopes. And I can send you this report if you want to link to it on your page so that people can see the maps that we have that sort of identify like what areas of the watershed might be more important for protection and might have sort of more bang for your buck conservation wise. So a cumulative effects analysis actually really helps us get down to what sacrifice is and where we define that balance.
So when you talk about protection, are we talking about literally nothing happens on that land base, or are we talking more from a conservation perspective? Okay, hunting, fishing, recreational use.
Yeah.
How do you make that definition?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word protection can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And the great thing in land use management is that we have an array of tools to accomplish protection objectives, right? So there's obviously the whole suite of Alberta provincial parks and Alberta protected areas that offer protection for various ecological resources. But there are other protective measures that can be applied through public lands, regulatory systems, or permitting systems that would sort of prioritize a little bit more conservation in a particular area over resource extraction, or require resource extraction to meet higher standards of reclamation or environmental impact assessments or whatnot. So the word protection can actually mean a lot of different things, but the outcome is really about trying to protect the headwaters of these watersheds in ways that trout populations continue to thrive. So that means that they have ample breeding habitat and habitat for meeting their daily and annual needs, right?
So when we talk about the science, and you folks, as you stated, made a presentation on the Grassy Lakes, um, who this is a strange question maybe, but does it matter where the science is coming from? If it's a company, if it's a government that puts forth their scientific evidence versus from an independent third party science assessment, and we've seen it time and time again. Where does the gavel come down on in terms of accepting that information?
Yeah. So without the risk of getting too nerdy on you, we are a group of scientists, and so we are very conscious of where the science comes from and how robust and credible it is. And the scientific community has a peer-reviewed process. So I'll just explain a little bit about that. Like, as a researcher, I conduct my research and I come up with my results and my recommendations for management. And I write a scientific journal article and I submit that to a scientific journal, like Conservation Biology is one of them, for example. And then it enters into a peer-reviewed process. So then my paper is reviewed by 4 other scientists who don't know me and who don't know my work. And they review the paper to make sure that the methodology I've applied is robust and that the statistical analysis is appropriate and that the final recommendations actually are supported by the data. And once a paper goes through that process and it's published in a journal, then it automatically has a level of robustness that we can trust as scientists. That process, that peer-reviewed process, can be quite onerous, and it is difficult to, it's not so timely all the time, right? Like, it can take a long time for papers to get approved. So that is one of the challenges that we have. But I think that this is one of the reasons why work of the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society can be so critical in this conversation, because we are an organization of scientists that have the skills to review the science and to think about it critically, and then to make assessments on its level of credibility and robustness. And that was what we did with our Grassy Mountain Mine submission, was that as a group of biologists, we reviewed the environmental impact assessment, or parts of it. I mean, the environmental impact assessment for Grassy Mountain was thousands of pages. So I'll be honest, I didn't read the whole thing, but I read the wildlife parts, and we sit down and we discuss whether or not that environmental impact assessment was robust. Would it pass a peer-reviewed process? And one of our biggest concern with the Grassy Mountain Mine was that the environmental impact assessment was not robust. The methodology was not robust. The analysis was sometimes inappropriate. And so therefore, the recommendations or the conclusions around the environmental impact of that mine were also not credible. And that is a challenge, because the environmental impact assessment is a very significant document in the consideration of whether or not these developments should proceed. And if that assessment is not done at a high enough standard, then the resulting recommendations might not be accurate.
Well, there is talking about conversation. I hope you and I can have another conversation in the near future. Thank you so much for your time today and some insight into what obviously is not a cut and dried issue. There's lots of moving parts to it, but we thank you so much for providing a perspective, at least from the science world.
Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to come back anytime. It was wonderful chatting with you.